started. I think we're all here that are going to be here, at least at the start. Maybe some more will join us. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome back to the Gadamer Reading Group. And we have an interesting set of texts today, right? We have a talk Gadamer gave at, it's a complicated set. We have a published piece, The Eminent Text and Its Truth. We have a set of responses from a conference in 1978 to a talk, The Eminent Text and Its Truth, but we don't know if the published piece is the same talk as the talk he gave, because the published piece is translated from German and came out later. We also have a talk he gave just a couple days later from the conference at the University of Iowa as a series of talks there that's on the same topic, the eminent text. So we have these set of texts, and it's not always clear how they're interconnected with each other. For example, we don't really know if the response and discussion were to the version of the text that we have, or whether it was modified and revised afterwards in light of the Q&A to create a new text later. But given that, I thought I want to ask if there's something that somebody really wants to start with that is sort of, they're chomping at the bit to get to a certain issue in one of these sets of texts. Just raise your hand and we'll jump in. John Arthos, go right ahead.
Yeah, so I was intrigued by Bruns's response, which doesn't agree on many points with the published paper that we have. Flat disagreement, so I'm not sure that these relate to each other. So there's one sentence in Bruns's, and this will take me to the Gadamer section that I wanted to ask about. So Bruns says, from Gadamer's point of view, the eminence of a text is never conferred by anyone. It does not repose upon a critical or aesthetic judgment. Mm-hmm. So then when you look at the really crucial section in the published paper on the inner ear, this is the part I want to sort of ask about. So this is on page in the published paper on page
7, right?
It's called The Eminent Text. Is that page 7?
Page 7 is where he talks about the inner ear.
Yeah. So there he sort of disagrees with Vallée and with the modern information aesthetics, and he says these theories about an autonomous text forgets that someone must be there. Right. So every reader of a successful poem experiences the same finality. And he contrasts the inner ear of the reader with the contingent materiality of the reciting voice. So, and he says this a bunch of times, like in The Relevance of the Beautiful Essay. He says there's something grating or odd about listening to a poet read his or her own poetry, right? So that's the contingent materiality of the reciting voice. The ear rejects this residue of if the eminent text, and he defines it here, is sort of the complete unity of the voice and the idea, the word and the voice, right? It's the inner ear that hears that. And then here in this section, he sort of emphasizes that the poetic structure, this is fascinating, is formed by us in the act of reading, right? So structure is the key term in this essay, and the unity of the structure is only completed by the reader, right? So the reader and the reader is always changing through time, so it's not as though there can ever be a final reading. Um, but so the structure has unity, but only because of the contribution of the reader and the ability of the reader to know what that text sounds like in their inner ear, right? Right, which is this ideality that he has in his mind, which sort of drains it, filters it of all of this residue, this sort of material residue, right? Uh, okay, so that's his theory, and so my question is about the inner ear, because a lot of this goes back to where he really spells all of this out is in the Kant section of Truth and Method, the first part where he's talking about the way in which Kantian aesthetics is sort of perverted by the subjectivization of the later aesthetics. And the point he wants to make about this, because he's always against the subjectivization of, and he talks about, in Kant's sense, he says, the universality of the sense, and this is a quote, grounds commonality and creates community. So there is his anti-subjectivism, right? So my question is, how do you square the circle between his pronounced anti-subjectivism, this notion of eminent texts grounding commonality and creating community, with this reliance on the inner ear, which sounds, at least, I mean, it doesn't sound, is there anything that sounds more subjective than the inner ear, right? Of the reader. So that's my question. That's the part I'm trying to sort of square right now.
Yeah, what to make of that discussion of the inner ear, right? Because that does seem to suggest that the meaning of the work only comes to fruition in its proper performance by somebody who has captured something through their inner ear, right? But then it seems that that's subjective, and that's not something Gadamer wants to say. That's sort of the main concern, right? Yeah, Jay, you want to get in? Or does someone want to get in the third?
Actually, I just found this that David was talking about. Here's Gadamer a couple of weeks later at the Fergland Society. He said, I said with the inner ear because I'm indeed convinced that the transformation of a literary text in performance recital, or whatever it may be, is always away from the apperception by reading and going in a way towards a new realm of contingencies where everyone has a different voice. I've heard it better. So we do art. I'll send this to you, David. There's a section that he writes about the inner ear right here. And there's also, I'll send you the link for a video there. You might catch Gadamer with that comment to Alan Bloom about Plato there. But I said, there it is right there. So anyway, it's a very fascinating idea. So he's carrying it, Gadamer's carrying this on in a variety of realms. Very fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
Jim, a little housekeeping here.
John.
David, Jim Rizzer just texted me and asked me to ask you to text him the link.
Okay. I don't have his phone number, but I can email him the link.
Email him the link, yes.
Yep.
I think that's what he said. It came up and let's see, came in and out. Let me see.
Yep. Okay, I sent him an email.
I do not have the Zoom link, yes.
Yep.
And I was going to say,
I sent it to him. Thanks, John.
oh, well, okay. I was going to add, if I can, just as a general thing, is that what struck me is the way he differentiates between writing and speaking. A text is not speaking. It's not making an assertion. It's not a claim. It's not a. And the Greeks were the first people. He talks about the creation of the alphabet. The Greeks were really the first to create the alphabet. There were lots of scripts and so on, and less Semitic. And some even think that the Phoenicians originally got it from Linear B. But anyway, the I think that's it's if anybody can figure that one out, let me know. Like this distinction between the way it runs through there, like the first page, he mentions like 14 times the word text, and it's distinctly to be separated from speech, and that's why inner ear is not listening to someone else speak. It's being able to reformulate and restructure writing, which is the Greeks were literacy wouldn't have been conceivable without what the Greeks did. Totally inconceivable. So I just throw that in there to John's, just a little background. I don't know how to hook it up, but anyway, that's what I wanted to add.
So Johnny, Chava, go ahead.
Sorry, I don't really find the sign for raising to raise my hand. There are 2 points I would like to address if you are also interested in. The first is the easier one. That is the problem of the connection between the category of classical and the eminent text, because I think that there are obviously some parallels. I mean, if we come there, we can bit into that. The second is perhaps a bit more complicated, that concerns the question of the necessity for every artwork or work of fine art to be read, to be interpreted, in order to be there, in order to have full presence. The problem is obviously that either we say that we have different grades of existence, which seems odd. There is a semi-being of an artwork, and if we encounter it, if we read it, then it will have its full presence. I mean, that's not so attractive. Or we say that the uninterpreted or unread artwork does not exist in the proper sense of the word. I mean, that's also somehow not so convincing for the cases of artworks that have an object-like existence, paintings, architecture, and so on. I mean, of course, in the case of music, you can argue that a composition does not exist before or outside of being interpreted. But so, I mean, that's a complex I would like to address.
Yeah. Thanks, Chava. And you're looking at the same page that John was. This is page 7.
That's page. Yeah, it's exactly page 7. I mean, of course, it's a somewhat broader discussion, because if you narrow down the topic of the paper to poetic works, then I mean, you don't really have the problems you have with paintings or buildings, which are artworks at the same time.
Mm-hmm. But he seems to be wanting to do that. We have the line that works of fine art, even those of architecture, must be read. And then he transitions, as you said, to music and theater, which are the easy examples, right? He puts out the hard example and he shifts to the easy examples. And I think we all agree music doesn't exist until it's performed, interpreted, right? Until it's made there.
Yeah, I mean, even in that case, one could argue that there are notes, and to some extent, notes constitute something that is previously settled or fixed, and you are not entirely free to invent something if it is. I don't know, a piano concerto of Mozart. Then I mean, you are not entitled to make an improvisation on Schoenberg's Pierrot Lunaire or something.
Right, sure. It's no longer Mozart then. So what do you think about this, John? This takes us back to the inner ear in the same paragraph. He says, Uh, uh, this he's talking about the reproductive arts. He calls them theater and music.
Yep.
They are an interpretation, and they possess the character of an original creation. Though Chaba might say it's maybe not as original as maybe just sitting down and painting a painting from scratch, right? But even this original creation remains subjected to the judgment of the inner ear, and that means ultimately subjected to the indestructible and so easily destroyed unique figure of the poetic structure. So there, the inner ear is subject to the poetic structure, is it? Or is it the idea that the inner ear always has to bring out a poetic structure? When you're performing something, when you're performing Shakespeare on stage, and you perform it in a way that makes it intelligible, that people can hear what's being said and get the ideas. And it's the inner ear which guides that, and it guides that by picking up on the structure, the poetic structure of the play. Is that how you would talk about that, John Arthos?
Well, I mean, there have to be constraints on both sides based upon his idea of the eminence of a text, right? In other words, certain texts for him rise to the level of eminence,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's certainly readers, right? And he's very careful not to talk about this in terms of experts or critics or anything. He's talking about communities in general that recognize the eminence of a text. So there's always the need for judgment on that end. But also, I mean, he's also clearly not saying, so he gives the example of kitsch, right?
Mm-hmm.
He does believe that there are, so this is the tricky thing, because he's coming into this whole thing, right? This is 78. So English departments at this point are already on the warpath in terms of, the canon, a list of essential works, right? So he wants nothing to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, and he doesn't really address that part of it in this paper, right? But that has to be an issue. Is what it's not just any text that becomes an eminent text.
Okay. But would you say that the role of the inner ear is only important for eminent texts? I mean, if I'm reading a piece of Gadamer aloud to you all, you might hear think, well, that's not how I would emphasize it or pace it. I mean, doesn't any text read out loud have that sort of contingency materiality?
No, he distinguishes very clearly. He gives 3 examples of things that are not eminent texts because they're instrumental.
Right.
He says prayer, oddly enough, he would probably take that back. Law, a legal text.
Right.
That's probably, all of these he would take back in other contexts. But I guess he wants to offer examples of texts that are not eminent texts because they have a utilitarian value, right? Their primary function is to communicate a meaning that has no necessary relationship to the manner in which it's expressed.
Okay.
Because the whole point of an eminent text is this is a perfect unity of the language and the thought.
Yep. And the sound.
If I may.
Yeah, John.
I once had a very interesting conversation with Gadamer. We were heading on a long drive, and I had given him this book of poetry by D.H. Lawrence because there was one poem in there that I thought was interesting. And I said, I recently read Women in Love, and at the end of it, I thought, wow, I understand women now. And then I reflected, and I thought, no, I don't, not in the least. And Gadamer says, well, that's the purpose literary. It's to like he obviously thought it was kitsch, and I think he's right. Like because it's like to take you somewhere. Like it's not. It's like to create something that isn't truly real, And that's not an eminent, that's definitely, and Shakespeare, for example, I think is totally different because Harold Bloom, in his book on Hamlet, has a subtitle, Poem Unlimited or Poetry Unlimited. And it's taken from Polonius, who's a fool, who all the brilliant stuff Shakespeare puts in Polonius's mouth. It's at the end of this, comedy, tragedy, there's comedy, and then says, Poem Unlimited. And he sees, I think some of the lines in Hamlet are eminent, definitely eminent texts are definitely rise to the highest level of poetry. And it sticks in your mind. You memorize it, you remember it. And it's not like who produced the play or what interpretation you give. I mean, it's those words, it's the text, it's what, and I think he's dealing with the translation. How do you go from a visual medium, which is text, which is writing, and meaning and speaking, like the way everybody speaks every day? Like, how do you make that connection? And I think that's integrally involved in this extremely difficult thing he's trying to explain.
Yeah.
And the inner ear is not for, it has no relation to someone's statement or what somebody said or somebody's claim or this or that. It's to grab, and Greek was the first language that could do that could appeal to the inner ear in visual form as a text.
Okay.
David,
John.
I found the quotation in Truth and Method that is a direct response to your question. This is on page 52 of my edition, the 94 edition. The language of art asserts its claims and does not offer itself freely and indeterminately for interpretation according to one's mood, but speaks to us in a significant and definite way. And the second sentence is, and the wonderful and mysterious thing about art is that this definiteness is by no means a fetter for our mind, but in fact opens up room for play, for the free play of our cognitive faculties.
Yeah. Okay.
Which could you repeat that page number, John?
On my edition, this is Don Marshall's.
Yeah, I got it. I got a few of those. I got them all.
Page 52.
Thank you. Excellent.
So one question is whether we're clear about what he means by an eminent text. But also I wonder whether when he talks about eminent text, even the quote you just said, John, whether he's talking about works of art, texts that are works of art, whether it can simply be reduced to that. What he says about eminent texts is what he says about works of art, just in the case of texts, poetic texts, and maybe, literary theater, high literature. And it's because they're works of art that we say these things about them.
It's interesting that Sartre also refers to literature as false, something that he calls it false, and it doesn't coincide directly with reality.
Right. Of course not. Right. We don't want to. That's
and
not
so
the
that would
criteria
be
by which we judge it.
Yeah, and so I think the extent of kitsch is pretty very, very extremely, things that we see as literature would qualify as kitsch, as not, as opposed to a work of art. Yes.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Yes, Jim Risser, welcome.
Yes, pleasure to be here a little late. That's because I did not receive the Zoom link.
Sorry.
So forgive me because I'm in the middle of your conversation. But this essay is clearly about a literary text and not necessarily all art, because he does the whole idea of the performative, once you talked about music, I mean, Gadamer will say at one place, even the performative arts such as dance and music, that character is also in the arts that are not performative for the sake of reading and understanding. But the question of what he means by an immanent text is, I would say it's simply the title he gave for another essay he published. It's called, and he reuses this title. He takes this from an article he already published. It's called The Word That Stays. So I keep it that simple. What makes an immanent text, in fact, in the conversation from the talk, he even says something like that, but I really don't like this word imminence or imminent. And he tries to qualify what he means. But I think it's captured simply by it's a word that stays. And that's what doesn't happen in all those other things that he mentions. That's some of you were just mentioning about a prayer and so on, John was mentioning. So I'd start there.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, thanks, Jim. Appreciate it. I was trying to, the word that stays, is there another translation of that?
I think it was actually translated in the volume of Heidegger I edited.
Okay.
Volume of 1930s.
Okay. And that is one of the things he says about eminent texts in the Iowa talk. That's something you can return to again and again. Always get something new out of it by rereading it. It's never exhausted in an interpretation.
And just apropos what I was trying to say on page 7, only in the inner ear are semantic reference and tonal construct entirely one. So this is the bringing together of writing and speaking, of text, which is writing, and Aristotle says, how do we talk about it?
So I read that he says in a couple places in the Iowa talk and in here, he says that the thing about that makes poetry is the sound of the words is essential for the meaning of the poem, which is why translation of poetry is so difficult, because of the way it sounds in the original language is part and parcel of the meaning of the poem. So that's how. So I took that sentence a little more literally than you did when you talked about the tonal construct. That it's that only in the ear are the semantic reference and the tonal construct entirely one. Do you think I'm reading that too narrowly, John? When I talk about think about the literal sound of the poem.
I don't know. I don't understand it all that well.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's why we're talking about it.
I know. I think that's an interesting. I'd have to think about that. Could you restate that?
So I thought he said, I'd have to look for it. In both talks, I thought he said that in poetry, the sound of the words, sound of the poem, is relevant for the meaning of the poem, maybe even essential. That is, what the poem communicates is essentially connected in these specific sounds, and that's what makes it poetic.
Yeah.
Look around for that.
And that's sort of, it's hard for us because we don't see, we just see writing as stuff written, talk written, and we take it for granted. It's hard for us to go back to where the Greeks were on this.
Right. And then maybe the inner ear is what picks up on that connection between the sounds of the words and the meanings of the words in poetic speech, such that we hear a poet read their own poem and it doesn't sound quite right to us because the sounds and the rhythms don't seem to be doing, when they're read out loud, don't seem to be doing the right kind of work for the way the poem feels like it should sound or something like that. But I don't know. Ty, get in here. Help clarify this.
I don't know about that. But I did wonder about that at the end of the question and answer piece. There's a question about translatability or communication,
right?
And he sort of answers and says like, well, I think it's kind of poetry is sort of untranslatable, and I'm wondering if that is related to this in the sense that hearing a poem and or some kind of artwork or something, seeing it or replaying it, we have to. It's difficult to that inner ear part. It seems difficult to translate it, and I think that's what I was wondering with that. The connection of this answer is that it's sort of difficult to recreate the artwork, and it seems to also touch on the idea of translating something or communicating through art, and that's seems related to the actual doing of it through playfulness and things like that. That's just a thought I had from that.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thanks. Jim Risser?
Forgive me for going back to the original question about where the word that stays. I have it here. It's Palmer translated. He says the word that stays is an enlarged version of a paper that he presented in 87 at the Heidegger Society in Metzkirch under the title, The Truth of the Word.
The Truth of the Word, yeah. That is a repeated title. The Truth of the Word.
So, Jim, could I this notion of the text that stays? Nolan just he's got this IMAX version of the Odyssey out now, which everyone is flocking to see. You can't buy a ticket here in Berlin. So clearly the Iliad and the Odyssey are texts that have stuck around for a while. So what is it that makes a text stay? I think in The Relevance of the Beautiful, he even uses the phrase "the test of time." So if we stick with Gadamer, because other people have strong feelings about this, but from Gadamer's perspective, who decides that a text will stay?
Since you
and I.
I'll start. I think you're talking about two different things, John. He says it's the word that stays. So he wants to make the case for language is immanent in the case of the poetic word. So there's something about the manner of the presentation of language in a poetic word, in the poetic text, that you don't find it was described already, when it's like the message, it's just being something is said for the sake of something else. So that's part of the character of this word that stays, and why I think he probably uses that word eminent. It's at a heightened place of what language is at its core. What you were just talking about is, I think, what he describes the classic in Varhant Matoda. Since you mentioned the idea of canon, you're right. Anyone that reads Gadamer knows he doesn't want to promote something like a canon, but he does talk about that text that seems continually being reread, and in a way it becomes contemporary by virtue of these rereading. So he says that's all that we mean by a classic text. It's capable of subsequent readings. So if that's not Homer's Odyssey, even Phil, I don't know what would be.
Yeah, I before you got here, Jim, I quoted him when he talks about the communality that a work of art creates, right? That's where he's always headed. But doesn't that beg the question, though, right? Because what distinguishes literature from writing that's not literature is a level issue in a way. And so if he objects to the notion of sort of the elitism of eminence, isn't he kind of stuck with it?
Yeah, forgive me for answering first. It's not a conversation. Everyone can join in, of course. I don't think he thinks it as an elitism. Um, I think I'd rather say he thinks it has a special quality. That is, um, we see language being performed here when it comes to a poetic text in a way that you don't see it. Maybe perform is the wrong word, because at least in the conversation, he gets away from this idea of performance. But so you'd say language is enacted, which is close to translating Volkszug anyway. But so there's the enactment of language in its ability to say something that's simply heightened. I wouldn't call.
Yeah, I thought you got muted there for a second, Jim.
I said, sorry. And I'm not sure what I left out, so let the other conversants enter.
All right, go ahead, Max.
I was just thinking against, I guess, the elitism it seems like you can go to the other side of the one, I guess, seems like opposite of like the eminent text, which is like a text that kind of is no longer part of any other conversation, would be the living conversation. And that's why certain texts, as like part of correspondence and different things like that, aren't going to be part of that, even if they touch upon the same matters, because they're meant to be read. And I think he or someone mentions like a time when you'd read a letter and you might just rip it up afterwards because like you got what it said. But it seems that like, I don't know, kind of going back to Plato, and I'm thinking of parts in like the seventh letter and all that, talking about how, like written things aren't the place for like philosophy. I'm, broad, like probably not saying that too precisely, but just the living conversation as another way of seem as also just so valuable, seems to show that like the eminent text itself, while valuable, is not like the only way that like you could say language is important or something like that. And I think that gives room for all those things in between to have their place. But there is something special about that eminent text. It holds a special place in the way that we engage with language.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. That's exactly what we're trying to nail in on, right? Is trying to figure out what that special place is without it being the only place that this happens. I think that's good. Jay Golding.
I was going to say before I lose the point, there's a wonderful book by Adam Jeffsky called The Tragic Protest. We're talking about my time in Hawaii at that Heidegger conference, late 60s, that the tragic protest makes some distinctions between everyday texts and elevated texts that place some on Gadamer here. What I happen to be looking at is in a book, Heidegger's On Inception, is on Anfang, says, the pure staying is a staying away. Staying away is the pure unconcealment of the advental egress, never ever arrived or arriving. So it radiates, the staying radiates a glimmer of an inceptive dignity of inception. I'm going to just put that down as that. Certainly Gadamer had said to me, I'm sure Johnny had said to you as well, he spent a lot of time trying to unfold Heidegger's origin of the work of art. What he's writing now is on the way to different types of thinking.
Yeah, yes, I did my master's on the origin of the work of art with Adam Chesky. And Adam Chesky actually was communicating with Heidegger at the time. And Heidegger recommended the text that we use in the, which was Invitation to Philosophy. But Gadamer, in the beginning of philosophy, says that Homer would have been unthinkable without Greek writing, without the invention of Greek writing. It's just that level of abstraction was inconceivable with any of the Western Semitic texts or Hebrew or anything like that. and there's a connection, and there's a connection there. And I just want to suggest that it might sound outlandish, but to be aware, there's a book called Homer and the Origin of the Greek Alphabet by Barry Powell, and it was published in 1991.
Yes.
And Barry Powell's written a lot of stuff since then on this, and his book on Greek myth is sold, well over 200,000 copies of it. Like it's a textbook, his book on mythology, and he's a brilliant writer. But anyway, I would suggest no one has come up with any evidence that his theory is false. In fact, a lot of people are falling in line with it, that it was in order to copy down, the Greek language, Greek literacy, the Greek alphabet. He says, and other people agree with this too, there was no such thing as an alphabet before Greek. Like there were scripts and sineries and so on, but the nuance, the incredible accuracy, that the totality of feeling that's in Homer would have been in, and because it's the oldest literary oral text that has been fixed and preserved in writing. That's why it's the greatest. That's why we're all going to go and see the Odyssey because all the other stuff is lost, wasn't preserved. And John Otis, that's why, like, it sustains itself, like it's just the greatness of it, and the window it gives to us in the whatever it is, that it's the foundation of Western civilization. And not to be too ethnocentric here, but it is. Anyway, that's enough of jumbling around here. I just wanted to throw that stuff in. Thank you.
Let me ask on this, because you brought this up now, and I think it's relevant. Would you say that something fundamentally changes when something that is an oral text, a story, even an epic story, becomes written down? Because I think for Gadamer, there's a fundamental shift when now we are putting it into words where the audience now may be someone living 2,000 years away from now, as opposed to the immediacy of just speaking. In the same way, we've got this talk he gives, right, at Iowa, where he's clearly trying to reach his audience. There's this sense of him in the immediacy of the moment, as opposed to a text that's revised and written and polished and edited, and is anticipating objections. So I'm wondering about what happens when the text moves from being an oral text, something in the oral tradition, to being something in writing. Yeah, Jay.
Thank you for these wonderful comments. It's exciting me about all these things. I was going to say none but the brave. In my new book, I'm talking about Chinese star systems and the development of alphabets and the connection to the Greeks and Egyptians and so forth. This will be out, as I said, for people that just came in paperback soon, thank goodness, is Taoist phenomenology. That this is very well put. That in here I talked about stuff that you guys stimulated me with about Methodos and Tao, discussed by Gadamer, different than Heidegger's Logos and Tao, is absolutely amazing stuff. And John Beach is exactly correct. Last thing I'll say, I had the great joy of working with Sandy McKay that worked with Chadwick on the Minoan linears. So everything that John said is right there. By the time you have these characters, they have character. Characters have characters. You could gather things around them. And that's part of Gadamer's understanding of elevated text and the poetizing of text and staying and so forth. Anyway, that's all I'll say. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
David,
yeah, Cynthia, great. Welcome.
Sorry, I'm having trouble with the hand feature, just like Saba is. So yeah, I tend to read it a lot like the way that you described it, David, where it seems like in many ways, although he talks about different kinds of texts, he talks about novels, etc. He talks about, normal, the normal uses of language where we have some kind of utility function and how he wants to distinguish poetry from that precisely in the sense that it has this unity of sense and sound at this very heightened degree. And that to me seems to be part of why it forms this configuration, right? It conforms this something that stays. It's not something that we just that the words just disappear because now we have what we need. When I say pass the salt and now I have the salt, I don't need to linger with those words. They don't stay, they don't stand.
Right.
But when we have, poetry or we have a great novel or something like that, he talks also about how it forms a meaningful whole. He uses that term on not meaningful, but he says whole on page 6. He talks about a meaningful whole in the context of his discussion of Gebilde in several different, texts that he has. So it seems to me that this idea of configuration, on the one hand, he's emphasizing the connectedness of sound and sense when he talks about poetry. He's highlighting that here, but that notion of configuration, I think, is consonant, or it's there in all of his discussions of art, because there's something about this meaningful whole where you have these parts that are internally related in such a way that other forms of language just aren't, right? You could, and I think that's tied to what you were saying about the translatability. When you have a lyric poem, that's untranslatable. You can't just change one of the words out. You can't do that, but you can with a novel. You could imagine some line or word being replaced in a novel, and not like fundamentally changing or destroying that thing as a work of art. So
yeah, all right, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Cynthia. Jim.
Yes, Cynthia, thank you for that comment. Helps bring some clarity, I think. And I just add to it, when you said the word configuration, my ears pricked up. Not sure about my inner ear, but my ears pricked up. That's well, Denny Schmidt likes to translate the Gebilde, Verwandten des Gebilde, as he wants to translate Gebilde as text. I'd rather say the word you just used, it's configuration. And that might go back to I'm not sure how much of there was an earlier discussion about the relation of when Gadamer speaking about poetry, but what about the question of all art? I think configuration is a good way of saying what any work of art will do. It's a kind of a composition, but that's can be misleading. But a configuration is exactly what a text does, that weaving together. So thank you for bringing that word about. I think it's an important word to help us understand Gadamer and art a little bit more.
Here's something that I found out, if I can just quickly interject this, is Eddie once gave me, by the way, a photograph of his in his living room in China of the 10 volumes of Gadamer's collected works in Chinese, translated into Chinese. He had it on, the books, yeah. So that's interesting. Jane might be interested in that.
Yeah, I have some of them. I need to get a couple of volumes, but they're fantastic. They make me rethink everything.
Interesting.
Max.
Yeah, I wanted to say something because we just mentioned back when we were talking about the different kinds of works of art, and just one thing that I thought of with like the need for, say, like interpretation actually came. There was a thing about archaeological digs that my wife Heather was telling me about a while back, where they were excavating certain buildings, and they, were finding things. I'm sure they were measuring the rooms, but they kept finding these like stones, and they were just like, okay, like sweep those off, like whatever. But then at some point, somebody finally realized that these stones that they just thought were just like things on the ground, debris or something, were actually weights for the looms. And so where the few places, or when they finally started recording where these things were, they actually started getting information about how things were in the room. But the way what I thought that was pertinent to this was um, even though something as simple as like a tool, an artifact as pieces of a loom needed to be interpreted, to be recognized, to be like there for people, as for a while they were just debris. And so I think in a certain way, like that shows that even like, art that has like these objects that seem to persist still need interpretation to kind of be what they are. And in the same way as I think Gadamer talks about, you know, that there's something special about eminent texts, but there is like I think something about all texts need some kind of interpretation. It's just when you get to the eminent text, that's where it kind of, that with that full equivalency of sense and sound, the interpretation becomes something that is inexhaustible. But I don't know, just like that kind of continuum between even like simple artifacts up to texts in a certain way of, I guess, interpret the need for interpretation and interpretability, even if there are different qualities of it.
So, Max, at the very beginning, John Arthos read this quote about when the poetic structure is formed by us in the act of reading, right? And Cynthia talked about configuration and structure and things having a meaningful whole. Would you say that we can't talk about things having a meaningful whole without them being interpreted as such and recognized as such? That these are things that come out of our engagement with them, that have this structure?
I mean, I at least what I was saying was at least any artifact that we
Yeah.
have, I think needs some kind of like in some ways is in need of interpretation on some degree. But like I think even when we go into looking at like nature, I think there's a reason why education in the science, like about nature and science and all that is important because until you kind of have like you need to engage with it, and then you need, there's almost even the hermeneutic circle comes in with just understanding what you're looking at in a forest.
Mhm.
And so like even there, the interpretation would come in, um, even when you're just dealing with trees, the way I look at trees now is different than the way I did back then, even just purely recognizing what they are, let alone, artistic values and all of
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Even recognizing that you're looking at a book, there's going to be something
Yep,
you're
that,
bringing
yeah.
to it to start with. Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Michael, we lost you for a minute. Are you back?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Just to add to the conversation, I think there's another part of the text where he tries to describe what makes a text imminent that we haven't talked about yet, that I just wanted to
Mm-hmm.
offer on page 6, in the third paragraph, where it says it starts the text as literary construct.
Mm-hmm.
He uses the term explication, and I haven't heard him use that word to describe eminence before. And I think that kind of coincides with what we've been talking about with the need for interpretation. Explication is another word that can give us a better sense of eminence. It's something that a text that requires us to or ask us to explain it. We talked about Homer earlier. It's something that crops up back over and over again because we use it to explain our life and how we understand our life. So what constitutes eminence, and what I think he's saying there is a text we use to explain our life. And so I thought that was another interesting way to explain eminence. So I just wanted to offer it to the discussion.
Yeah, right. Thanks. And he also says that it's never exhausted through the explication. Also, so it needs the explication, and there's always further explication to come. Right? There's always a realization that living with this text is something that can always add to ours. Yes, Jim.
Yes, I'm not disagreeing with the comments, but I just would like to add. I remember you put in the German in here that explication is the German Auslegung. Well, that's Heidegger's word that we have for interpretation, and it's literally a laying out. Sometimes explication in English can be a little bit more misleading. Like Heidegger doesn't go around saying what we're doing is explicating our lives when we engage in the process of understanding. So when you say that in English, it should not feel right. So my comment was to say I don't quite like the word explication, but as I see it being used for Auslegung as a kind of a laying out, okay, I can follow what's being said. Most translators won't stay with that, and you don't find Gadamer himself using that word so much either, outside of truth and method.
Yes, good. John Arthos.
Okay, so yeah, I keep on puzzling over this really rich idea. So the question is, what remains? What stays? What's fixed? So we know that it's not the meaning that's fixed; it's the textome that's fixed, right? But so if I think of an example, so Shakespeare has this phrase that stays with us, right? The dark backward and abysm of time. That's a contender, right? Because he seems to have found, the perfect way of saying this thing. The full equivalency of sound and sense, right? And that becomes useful to us in our lives because that text in particular, not someone other's paraphrase, but that thing that he wrote down, that Shakespeare wrote down. All right, so that's fixed, right? But then he talks about the free play of our understanding of that text as part of its structure. That's the hard part for me. And it's the quotation that you repeated, David. I'll repeat that again because I think that's such a potent thing that he says there. He says, poetic structure is formed by us in the act of reading. Okay, so that word structure, right? It seems to me that the structure in one sense is the finding of the right word, the perfect word to express this idea. That's something that the author did. And that's the thing that remains. That's what makes it eminent. On the other hand, he's saying that we, every time, because of the inexhaustibility of the meaning of that text, we are constantly giving wholeness to that. Well, he says to that structure, but what structure?
And the German word is Gebilde.
Hmm.
So, yeah, what is that configuration? What is that structure?
I have an immediate response to that, John. So I took that as just another way of him saying that we have to be these actively engaged participants with the work, right? That's part of the artwork's ontology, and that's we have to actively retrace the configuration or the meaningful configuration, the meaningful whole, etc. Synthesize its parts, etc., etc. And so, in that sense, we also act as, in a way, loosely speaking, co-creators in that we actively have to be a part of this event, this thing that comes forth for it to come forth. I think that kind of goes back to what's, maybe what Savo was saying when he was saying that, and I guess I would disagree and not have as many worries as maybe he has, but feel free to say whether you do. It seemed to me the way you were describing the work, or with the worries that you were describing, that you were seeing the artwork as an object, kind of a static object, whereas for Gadamer, it's just not. It's a dynamic something that it's something that comes forth and speaks to us. There is an identity, but that's also, in a sense, dynamic in that it's never going to say the same thing to exactly the same person in every historical period, et cetera, et cetera. Nonetheless, we can still very clearly identify the work as being, Homer's Odyssey or whatever it might be. But I thought that maybe some of the worries that you were voicing were perhaps because you were maybe just disagreeing with his notion of the work of art as an event, as opposed to maybe like just an object that's there.
John, you want to say something to that, or should I go to the list?
I mean, it's this quandary for me of the text itself. It's the same text, right? It's Bach's chorale. It's the that comes down to us. That doesn't change, right? The the poetic text, especially those words that are printed and published and passed around don't change. So there is a certain fixity there, right? But that's not the Gebilde. And I just still I'm still struggling to connect the fixity of the text and its endurance as an eminent text because of the way in which it achieves this lastingness. Why is it lasting? Why is it lasting if not for its structure, right? On the other hand, the fact that he wants to say that we are always reconfiguring the text ourselves. So those two things don't quite fit together yet for me.
Okay, I guess Chaba get in here because you had your hand up early, Chaba, and put it down. But Chaba, do you want to join? Did you put your hand down again?
He's muted.
Oh, he's
Sorry.
muted. Okay. Good,
Sorry, I already managed to raise my hand, but I lost my voice. So I just want to add to what Cynthia said that I think to say that we are co-creators of the work of art is an overstatement, because we have to contribute, and I'm fully agree with what you're saying. We have to contribute to the work of arts becoming present or acquiring full presence or being, but we do not modify it in a sense that could be called as creation. I would argue, but that's an additional point. And then we could, of course, say, and that could be connected to a previous remark of Marx, that what we need in the case of complex meaning or structure or meaningful structure or configuration, if you want, is that we grasp it, we fulfill or perform an act of understanding. And I think that what Gadamer sometimes calls reading, lesen, in a broader sense, that corresponds to such an act. Gadamer, in this sense, claims that we have to read a building, an architectural object, and that means that we have to go around, to walk around this, to go inside, and we have to put it together, and that would be reading. And without such a complex, also synthetic activity, there is no such thing as a building or a configuration of whatever art. So that's what I wanted to add, and I think that this is this complexity what Gadamer wants to underline with the eminent character of the text, and John's question, what counts as eminent text. I would trace that back rather to the concept of the classical, as in a previous remark James noted it. So these are, I think, two different issues.
Okay. Yeah, that helps. Michael?
Lots been said since I had this thought, but
Okay.
I'm just wondering if maybe what may help us understand this is Gadamer's concept of a transformation into structure. We keep talking about structure. Maybe the us being co-players and contributing to the artwork can also be thought of as the transformative part of that concept. The fact that we are creating the structure with the work of art, and it's so we're kind of like co-players, like Cynthia was saying, in creating the work of art. So that transformative part can be kind of the element that includes our subjectivity, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
I just want to say one thing, and that is, perhaps I overspoke. I wasn't meaning we're actually creating, the work in the same way that the artist is. I just mean that we're retracing, as Saba was saying with Gadamer's notion of reading, we're having to sort of synthesize the parts, and in that sense, it has to. We're participating in its coming forth, so to speak, and that's how we have to understand it. So maybe co-player is better, co-performer, something like that. But yeah.
We're at very least we are the occasion for its transformation to the structure. Without us, it would not happen.
Mm.
Yeah. Yes, Jim.
Yes, Gadamer will say that poetry is to be read, the music is to be heard. So that enactment sense. In fact, John Arthos, this may go back to another conversation we had on one of these Zoom meets uh, when we discussed, or at least the artwork and word and image essay was brought into play, where he says, art is Vollzug, Kunst ist Vollzug. So I think Cynthia's comments and Kaspa's comments were really helpful, I think, for answering what I think is really a good question that you're asking, John. My only additional comment, because especially Kaspa, I think your remarks were so spot on to help with John's question, is to say, what then does being mean for Gadamer? Because in a way, by talking about the fixity of that text as if it's a substance, as if it's some, not object, but a substance, and Gadamer doesn't have a substance metaphysics. In fact, this gets back to John Beach's comment about the Greek language. The first meaning of being is simply, there it is. Being is there, right there. So there is no concept of being. There's no being and essence. There's no question of essence at that point. And I think Gadamer has that sense of being. So where is the artwork? There to be, it's there to be read. And it collapses a lot of that, the history of metaphysics that we're so accustomed to framing. I don't know. I'm just trying to add to it, but I thought that the earlier comments were very helpful.
Yep. No, that helps too. Thanks. Max?
Yeah, I was thinking about the that when we were talking about the forming of that poetic structure, and I was wondering if kind of Gadamer, like just thinking about Gadamer's I guess not only his love for Plato, but his kind of love for Aristotle, specifically in that forming of it. At one point, he talks about Aristotle's analogy to when we know, like, how do we know when we know something? It's like when we're treating soldiers are like en route, we can say, okay, like they're running, but then like when one or two people start forming the line again, yeah, the line hasn't formed. They're still in retreat. But at some point, we could look at them and be like, okay, like now they're no longer in retreat. They've kind of they've formed lines, even if it's not everyone, even if it's not completely. But like, and it's hard to know in the middle where that was. And I'm wondering if part of the that is where like that formation comes in. Like that's Aristotle talking about just anything that we might know. But with works of art, with like poetry, we are having to do that work bit by bit. You know, how many times you have to read a poem before you get it, before something clicks. The difference being when you're trying to understand like a squirrel or a tree or a rock, that's a thing that at least is much more independent of us. Whereas when you're dealing with a poem, you're dealing with language, which is dealing with community, which is dealing with dialogue, even if the text itself is fixed. And so you do have a difference there, which is why there's probably a greater dynamism in forming that structure. But there's still like that process of seeing the thing that's there, trying to get it, trying to piece it together until something clicks, even if you don't have the full thing. And just, I think it was it posterior analytics Gadamer is referring to, where he talks about those soldiers might give us a sense of, what he's meaning by forming that structure, not as if we're putting it together, not necessarily as the co-creator, but as trying to bring together in ourselves that thing that is there. Except the complication is now, since the thing that is there is something of language, which means that it's in communion, like we're in the in some ways, we are part of what constitutes it as the participants of the dialogue. There is a greater dynamism than you might see in trying to have knowledge of, say, a rock, though some might argue that in a whole different realm, but we don't have to go there. Anyway, I just thought that might be maybe giving a way that Gadamer might be thinking about that construction, rather than the way we normally think about construction, looking to Aristotle more than looking to, I don't know, whatever might be in our habitual cultural framework of doing that work of putting it together.
Right, and we know Gadamer uses that analogy, uses that example in Aristotle to explain what it is like to have a concept formation, right? So why not say that it might work in this case too when it talks about the formation of a structure or a configuration? Yeah. John Beach.
Yeah, I'm still thinking about John Arthos's question, and I recall on page 7 where in truth, every reader of a successful poem experiences the same finality, and is able to make audible the pure ideality of the construct. And without quoting more text here, the term ideality is, I think, very important because we can think about Plato, and the beautiful is a certain, Gadamer talks in the Theaetetus and the Sophists and so on about the noetic, which is the ideality and the ineffability of the eidos and so on. And I think that this comes from mathematics. Plato takes this. There's a certain realm of the noetic, like it's not. And I think that, and he ends that paragraph by saying, only in the inner ear are semantic reference and tonal construct entirely one. And this is why it's rather referring to, as Jim quite rightly says, there's no substance. I mean, Aristotle, makes a little, sort of adjusts Plato on this thing, but as Jim says, it's a sensible sort of object. But it is like the beautiful, like there's an ideality of it that we can't change or we can't alter, but it speaks to us, and it speaks to everyone. And as Cynthia says, everyone has to grasp and sort of construct that the words in that way. This semantic reference, at any rate.
Yeah.
It's very Greek, I think. Gadamer is being very Greek in this.
Right, the way that sort of meaning functions in these to have this sort of ideal character that has a presence that comes to the fore in the reading of the poem. Right, this is the ideality, is the meaning, what it has to teach us and tell us, what we might say is the truth.
Yeah, it's beyond our control.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Jim, where's there?
2 quick comments. I wanted to comment on Max, but I got to comment back on John. Beach. I mean, the whole question of ideality, I don't think it's ideal so much. Well, Gadamer uses that, but I clearly see it as a reference, speaking of the Greek, back to the Phaedrus. It's Plato's question about what happens when it is not lived, but when it's fixed in writing, when you have the written text. And I think Gadamer uses the word ideality because it's richer than just saying you're removed from the most important point for understanding, which is the lived conversation, where you can directly ask your opponent to answer. But that relates to my question back to Max. Thank you for that reference to the forming of the universals in Plato, in Aristotle. And David, you referenced that Gadamer uses that in relation to experience. But what he's really talking about in that an almost invisible point, I actually think is that he's describing how we understand. I'm happy to share with you one of my recent papers about the understanding and the act of understanding, which is to say that understanding does not occur by a logical process by which you reach a conclusion. And so the act of understanding is like Aristotle's way of describing how we arrive at first principles. We understand in the same way. We don't simply reason to that first, but it's by something like a leap. Now that's a little bit, could be a misleading word too, but there's something that I just say that's what, it's what nous is like. That is, you don't reason to nous. Anyway, I'm not sure where I was going with that, other than to ask you to think. Max's great comment was, this is really all about exactly what Gadamer means by understanding.
Yeah, great.
Oh, could you repeat that? Really all about, what was that?
What Gadamer means by understanding.
Okay.
Yeah.
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 Application.
Are you?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
There we go.
No, first, thanks, many thanks to Jim. What you said about being, I found really, really helpful. And what you just said was also extremely helpful. Well, there's three things that I had. Let me see. I'm going to go in reverse order because I remember the last one first. Before we get to, or when we get to the next topic, I would love to discuss what he says in his in the last paragraph about refusal. I thought that was super interesting. Yeah. But going back to John's, this is the second thing. John's question, excellent question about, well, what is it that remains? And I wonder if there's not something in there about just the fact that these texts or these works of art that we keep coming back to, they're presenting something about the human condition that can continue to be articulated or can continue to be presented in these different contexts that speak to us, right? They continue to grab us, to captivate us, to make us have to think more about ourselves, question our society, our world, issues of justice, et cetera, and that when we encounter those kinds of texts, or works of art, that's part of what it means to have something that stays or remains. And then what was the last thing? So the thing about refusal, seems like there was one other thing, but I've lost that. So yeah, I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about refusal.
Okay, let's look at that last paragraph. It's on page 10. So my conclusion is, I'm looking at the German at the same time. What today aligns itself with the great truths of world literature is true, although, if not indeed just because, it is full of refusal. What assertion can lay claim to more than to have that which is emerge from it? Even in refusal, there is bestowal. I'm trying to find the Verweigerung is refusal. Verweigerung. And this is in the context where he's returned to the question of what it means to talk about truth and falsity. So he moved away from that to talk about the eminent text, and he's returning back to say, so what sense does it make sense to talk about truth? Obviously, Hamlet's not true because there was a guy who lived in Denmark. But there is a truth to it. And then he said, well, does it make sense to talk about the falsity too? And part of that, I assume, is the refusal. The idea that there's much more to be said. Is that how you understand the refusal? How do you understand the refusal, Cynthia? You brought this up.
Yeah, no, that is along the lines. I mean, I see him basically, it's another way to talk about the symbolic character of the work of art, right? That it's always withholding something. There's always something, there's some kind of excess, something hidden. And for him to connect this with truth just seems to me, in a way, also kind of a Heideggerian move, right? To talk about this notion of aletheia and this constant interplay of revealing and concealing. So yeah, just that it's not something that's going to be exhausted, and that's why it has the kind of being that it has is the kind of or it's the thing that makes us have to linger with it. We have to keep going back to it, and so it I think there's just a lot in this notion of refusal. It seems to me he's really highlighting the excessive character of the work of art, and the fact that, you know, this notion of temporality is tied in here too, that the artwork has its own temporality that we have to subject ourselves to, and then we have to continually linger with it. We have to, you know, this notion of verweilen that he uses all the time, tarry, linger, and that there's this vial, you know, that opens up this interval of time that feels like timelessness. And so, yeah, I just think that it's just another way maybe for him to talk about the symbolic character of the work of art.
Symbolic character. Yeah, sure. Jim.
Yeah, Cynthia, that's very helpful. I'd only add to that. It's part of the whole hermeneutics of facticity. I would say refusal sounds like an intentional, well, I have another synonym here. I'd say opacity. There's a way in which the word was said hiding, but even that, I like the word opacity better. It's what is opaque is not necessarily obscure. The opacity is simply what can't be seen or does not appear. So there's an element of opacity that you see when Gadamer talks about something being untranslatable. It's the whole idea of an opacity. One could even begin to think of this. I know I'm going too far with this. It's just a word association. When Gadamer takes up Schelling's word of the unverdenklich. So that's indicating something like an elemental opacity at the heart of being. So a slightly different context than in the hermeneutics of facticity, but I think the terms resonate there as well.
Yeah, John Orthos.
Yeah, so this is helpful. So in that sentence, he has this very significant phrase, the great truths of world literature. So he's referencing a standard, or the fact that these things stay and are permanent. These are kind of criteria for us. I think what Max referenced when the phrase from Truth and Method that he called our attention to, the Verwandlung ins Gebilde, which is, so Heidegger and Gadamer are always talking about the way in which our encounter with a work changes us, right? It transforms us. So it's not weird. It's not the way I put it crudely before in interpreting his phrase here about the changing of the structure of the work. The Gebilde is, it relates in certain ways to Bildung. Yeah, we're always changing in relationship to our understanding of these texts, right? So we're being transformed. So we're part of the Gebilde in that sense. So I think I was probably relying too much on the sort of the structuralist sense of structure and not hearing enough this idea that he has of the Verwandlung ins Gebilde, this way in which history, we are a conversation. History is continually changing, but now we have these sort of handholds, right? In these great works of literature that he talks about are, in a sense, equipment for living, right? And that we're always changing and changing our understanding of the meaning of those eminent texts, and that's part of the Gebilde.
Okay. Yeah, Jay Goulding.
Oh, that's really great. I'm really enjoying everyone's comments. Carrying on what James Risser was saying, also this idea of refusal as a retreating egress, as a verfugender Ausgang, is images of Heidegger, since Gadamer is discussing that there. So you're laying something out as you're retreating, revealing as you conceal. Um, Heidegger takes that to the refusal of the last God in contributions. Gadamer is bringing it back into play.
Yeah. Yeah, Abdullah.
Hey, hello. So this meeting is going great. I'm writing a chapter on Gadamer and literature for a Palgrave handbook, and so it's been really timely, this discussion of the imminent text. I want to go back to John Arthur's earlier question of what stays. What I understand by poetic structure or the word that stays is when you read a poem, you got captured by an image articulated by the poetic word. So let's say Celan's poems. I've been rereading all the later writings of Gadamer, and just let me give an example from a poem, Celan's Tenebrae, quote unquote. We are near, Lord, near and graspable. So this graspability is what makes us captive to the image. And we read again and again this poem. Whenever I think a nearness to God, for instance, it also strikes me with the thought of God grasping me. And this word, this graspability or nearness, is now with me, present anytime. So stays with me like a trace, right? Having an impact upon my being. I am now sort of connected with the word, and I have been changed. And the poetic word as Gebilde has changed with my reading. So this is where I am getting at. John Arthur's later comments on the structure is also a cause structure, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Thanks, Abdullah. Good luck with your project. Max.
Yeah, I mean the first thing that just seemed to come up is just I mean it might just be more of a summary but just the emphasis that like the more like the reminder that all understand like that the constitutive of understanding in that very act, in that very event, is that we must change, that a change will happen in us. It's not some external thing, and probably related though. That's kind of more of a thought that came up was just thinking about the idea of the full of refusal, and I'm wondering if that idea of refusal in some ways comes from um in the back that idea of almost like the kind of scientific, though probably my wife who is a scientist would argue that it's not the true essence of scientific investigation, but that like scientific, I don't know, Baconian, the methodical, like tearing out the truth and the things of trying to find all that out from what we're doing, and kind of saying that against that, um like this is an area where we see very much the refusal of any of that kind of methodical grasping at greater understanding, and where we see the more fuller sense of why is it that, people say like, well, you answer a question, you got five more, and how that isn't a, that maybe gets to the more what was it when we met, it was opacity being maybe a more closer word to the what's happening, that we just cannot grasp the fullness of the thing, that there's always going to be more, and the goal is not to get to the end of it because that's impossible, but against that kind of methodical trying to force understanding, force, you know, the world to give us its secrets, there's going to be that refusal. And in the case of literature, I think it's um, very we can see it very strongly that if you try to force that understanding out, the literature is going to refuse any sort of grasp of what it's trying to say. That it's going to either be completely opaque, or like what you're going to get out of it is, you know, something, I guess, noticeably violent to the text to anyone who's, you know, kind of has read it with some, I guess, with their own human, I don't know, understanding, kind of trying to understand it.
Yeah. Yep. Good. John Beach.
Yeah, this is all great, and uh, I'm going to just step back a little bit, and just to try to broaden the scope a little bit. But let's say, for example, the greatest writer in the English language, I think, would be Shakespeare, and he perhaps the greatest poet as well, and perhaps he was a poet. I mean, I talked to a guy who translated the complete works of Shakespeare into Spanish for the World Library, and his theory was Shakespeare was really a poet, and but you don't can't make, but he was also a dramatist too, and of course his Shakespeare wrote his rights, this eminent text, this poetry to be spoken. But you can have, art isn't just limited to one sort of genre. And the same thing could be said about Bob Dylan, who is recognized as a poet, but he wrote his poetry to be sung, as did the bards of ancient Greece. They're like the Ulysses, the Odyssey was written to be sung, or was sung, and then it was written. But I mean, we can, I think we can be sort of we tend to sort of chop things up, a little bit. And like Ricoeur is an extreme example. I think was it only Mallarmé, the only true eminent text was a poem written by Mallarmé or something. A truly eminent text. But anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in just to complicate matters, or if it means anything, whatever.
Always welcome to be more complicated. These are all complicated issues. Jim, are you change your mind?
I'll go back briefly to Max again. Um, I'm not being too lighthearted, hopefully, when I say something like this. You got to tell your wife that you're interested in the process of understanding and not explanation. Because that is a profound difference. I've been arguing lately, and I get in trouble with some of my Gadamerian friends, that you can't think of understanding in the same way that we think of knowing. Again, Danny Schmidt has thought of this. So I've started even using the word sensibility. So I thought, Max, what you're describing very well is the hermeneutic position, which is, and this is the word that I think Cynthia used, is disaka in a way. It's a question of the meaning of trying to see what something is trying to say. And for that process of understanding, when we understand, let's not forget, Gadamer will always say, there's self-understanding. And self-understanding is not this reflexive act now. It means that I've brought to see something, and And now I too understand. I just don't, when I explain how water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, I don't change at all. But if I see something about the meaning of love in a sonnet or whatever, and I'm affected by, I really do understand it, it enters into my life. So I would say, yes, I'm not trying to get at the ultimate clarity about what things are. I'll leave that to science and the process of explanation. I'm interested in understanding things, and there's some unavoidable things that when you're doing science, they have ways to get around that. But when understanding doesn't, it's because understanding is not explanation.
Yeah, good. I wanted to jump in and say one more thing about refusal on the last page, if that's okay. It seems what he's talking about here on this last page, he's talking about Proust, Joyce, Beckett. He's talking about those who disintegrate all narrative techniques of plot, characterization, and time. Eliminating the hero. He's talking about this sort of rebellion against traditional texts, classical texts. And then he says general things about language, and then it says that even in a time of a dearth of tidings of poetry, there remain tidings. So even these contemporary authors who are turning against tradition, you still find tidings of poetry. You still find, he says, the combined sense of true or false, therefore, is fulfilled even vis-a-vis the contemporary mode of creativity that is not directed by a binding tradition. And then he says that doesn't mean we should take a sociological analysis toward these texts and just talk about what they tell us about ancient Greece. I assume that's what that's about. But instead, we recognize as true expression contemporary art that it aligns itself in a remarkable fashion with the art of other ages and peoples, that even with their rejection of the past and all these traditional ways of doing art, we find there is still a remarkable alignment even in their refusal. So when he says what today aligns itself with the great traditions of world literature is true even though it's full of refusal. So I think one way of thinking about what he's talking about here is how contemporary literature has turned against the grand tradition. And may make sense to talk about truth in literature when we're talking about Hesiod or Homer. But, do we really expect Joyce's Ulysses to be the next film that's going to be made? This is something different altogether, right? And he wants to say that, no, even in refusal, there's bestowal. Even when the Odyssey is taken up in its specific historical conditions, that is, we're going to do it as a film and we're going to get rid of all the gods, and there's still something to be learned from it, even if we accept it through our way of reading, which involves an elimination of a whole sort of things that the Greeks may have taken to be important a long time ago. Does that make sense? I think that's one of the things that's going on here at the back page. It's a little bit of a different emphasis, but it's also what he's talking about when he talks about recognizing the great truths of the world, even in a spirit of refusal. John Beach.
Yeah, just I think it might touch on this, David, from an angle, is that I think it's very important that Gadamer started out talking about the opening lines of Hesiod's Theogony, where he refers to the muses. And this is not, Gadamer's interpretation of this is not at all the interpretation of contemporary classicists at all of what this means. They take it as a criticism of Homer, a critique of Homer and so on, or of other poets. But Gadamer says, no, this is the essence of myth. This is the essence of poetry. You say both truth and falsity at the same time, and they wouldn't have the concepts or the a way of speaking about that conceptually. But I mean, I think that relates to refusal in a way too, because The and that's very important when we understand, try to grasp of Greek religion. Of course, they had no concept of what religion was. None of the ancient polytheistic societies had such a concept because there was no question. I mean, it was just everyday experience. But I think that should echo through this entire thing. Is Hesiod's, preface about the muses warning him, that they speak the truth and falsity too, and they're not gonna, they're not gonna tell you. You can figure it out.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks, John. I like that example. Yeah, Cynthia.
David, I really like the way you sort of broadened, you helped us to see, like, in context what he's saying. I think that dimension that you brought out was really important. A follow-up question on that relates back to some of the things we were saying earlier, that John was saying, John Arthos, that is. So if we can then take these, epic poems like we are today and having these remakes of them and really radically change them, or at least, we can change significant parts of them and yet still identify them as being, a version of the Odyssey. Could that be a way maybe to address some of John's questions, in that going back to that passage that he quoted from Truth and Method about leeway, about Spielraum, and that even in the configuration itself, even though it makes this configuration, right, it's that there's even leeway in the configuration in that, and that's also something that makes these works that stand have their special ontological character, that they can have this leeway and be changed in these ways, so that they, speak to us still, but yet are changed. So there's not a fixity, as if, we use the analogy of music. I think Sava brought this up. But, when you have the notes on the page of, like, Mozart, those aren't rigidly fixed either. When a classical player is performing Mozart, you can have two classical players play that exact same piece, and you're going to say, oh, I really like the way so-and-so plays it because of the way that they bring the legato notes out, or the ornamentations maybe that they have. So even, it seems to me, there's something about the work of art that has also that in that sense, where it's not fixity in this rigid way, and yet it still has this identity that can continue to speak through time because it has these aspects that speak to the human condition in powerful ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Jim.
I have a last question I want to ask that's different from the immediate conversation here. So if someone wants to follow what Cynthia was saying.
You want to come in on the same time? Yeah, go ahead, Ty.
I'll pause.
Just real quickly, thanks, Jim. And yeah, I just wanted to add to that. Like, it seems that Gadamer's, this relates back to, just as Jim pointed out earlier, understanding in general. And it seems that one of the key aspects of that is what is questionable. Talking about the muses made me think about that this sort of points to that idea in Gadamer that I don't have the wording right, but what orients us in our understanding isn't like something fixed, but rather what's questionable, or something that, in terms of the muses, what's true and false. And so I was wondering if, like, maybe what stands throughout these works of art is precisely that, something that's not fixed, something that's, like, brings up these, the questionability of what is at hand. So that's just what I was thinking at the end of that.
And that is what stays, as we say. That's been one of the returning questions, right? What is, when we say it stays, what is it that stays? And maybe it's something more like that. Yeah. Jim, we're ready. We've only got like 7 minutes left. We got to get this question asked and answered.
This concerns truth and falsity. And it's something that's said in the exchange after the talk. And is actually not said by Gadamer, but refers to what Gadamer would say. It's on page 12. It's by what's his name here? The guy I wasn't familiar with.
Oh yeah.
And he says that if you have page 12, it's at the bottom paragraph. I'll just read from the second sentence. A word, he writes in Truth and Method, is not an existent thing which one takes up and to which one accords the ideality of meaning in order to make something else visible through it. End of quote. In other words, Gadamer's truth is a truth without about. Now, that captured my attention because this is why it's actually a new question, but extends from beyond what we're talking about by tech. It's about whether language is always not just about Sinn, but about Bedeutung, and whether or not when Gadamer uses language referring to non-linguistic mediums of art, say dance and architecture and painting and music, of whether he involves himself in signification. He's always saying something about something when we understand. And can we fully, so my question is, I don't think that's true. That is, I agree with Graf. I don't think Gadamer ever intends to say that when we use language to understand something, we're not trying to talk about something. That is, we're not trying to make a referent by which the work would be referred to. So can we understand language without reference? Does language work without reference is my broader question. Maybe it's too late to entertain that here. I just wanted to tease you and say, I found a new question I've been asking about in Gadamer's hermeneutics, and it's related to this reading assignment for today. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the quote, we know what the view he's arguing against is the idea that words are just out there and I have ideas in my head and I'm trying to think about what word out there matches my idea so I can use that word to communicate my idea to somebody else, right? That sort of nominalism is what he wants to reject.
Right, but let me explain myself. Sorry for this self-indulgent. So like Dave Krelwitz, I'm trying to argue that Gadamer can fit with the way John Sallis speaks about art as sense, the double meaning of sense. And when I say that Gadamer still brings art into some form of a conversation, John Sallis and Dave Krell said the same thing to me. But you're making all language is always is about something. And so you're always in this idea of referentiality, even when you're not using a structuralist concept of language. And I want to disagree with that. So I just want to put a few comments.
I'm with you, Jim. I'm with you. That's what linguisticality is. That's Gadamer's ontology. I'm with you on that.
Would you say, Jim,
it's not an instrumental? Yeah.
All language is disclosive? Is that word okay? It doesn't mean it's referential.
Well, certainly for a good phenomenologist and hermeneuticist,
I would think so.
I would want to say language is disclosive, yes.
Yeah. So
and it's a question, what happens in the structure of language? Maybe John Beach is right here. Maybe it's just we have to think we're always linguisticality, but
we can have reference would be one way of explaining disclosure. Why does this word the word car points to cars, and that's why when I say car, we think car. But you don't need to have reference in order to have disclosure. I don't think. I think that's
Plato.
We'd want to argue. Plato.
He speaks of like for Plato, there was no like being and thinking. They were the same. There was an identity there, and thinking is a conversation with yourself. And you think in terms of words, of concepts, and so on. So, like, otherwise, we're so, we're so penetrated by the instrumental concept of language that it has a reference or it expresses something, but it doesn't. That doesn't mean. I know it's complicated, but Jim, I think your studies in music would free you of that. And anyway, that's a good point. I haven't thought. I can't express it very well, but I'm with you there.
we're coming near the end. Were there any thoughts about? We haven't talked at all really about the Iowa talk, and maybe it's more of a curiosity. As we read this and think, well, this is what it was like, Gadamer in the rough before things get polished. But were there thoughts about what went on in Iowa and the eminent text speech that we have a transcript of, a transcript that was then typed and then edited, revised?
I just don't think they understood what he was saying very well.
Yeah.
Neither do we. It's tough.
Do we know if Gadamer actually had, as he presented the talk, a manuscript and not one of his 3x5 cards? That would I'd be interested to know.
I doubt it. I doubt it. I don't think he ever used a manuscript when he spoke. I don't think he ever did in his life. That's my belief.
So he might have written the text after he presented it.
Yeah. He would, when I'd be driving him to speak to talks, you didn't try to speak with this guy. He was writing. He was composing his lecture, and at times, like he'd say, tomorrow, you can squeeze me like a lemon, but right, and even the one he gave in the great one he gave in Ottawa, there was no text. The Jean Grandin said, yeah, he had to have read it from a text because his English wasn't good. No, there was no text. And no, he didn't. He would edit afterwards. He would polish it. He would structure it. He would sort of after. But originally, whenever he spoke, it was like in the Phaedrus, when they say if you can't give a verbal presentation after without using a text, you're no philosopher.
My guess is he had a text 2 days earlier in Minneapolis, because we have these written comments that were ready to go, and certainly the more literary one wasn't just made up on the spot. So they had to have come up with some comments based on something ahead of time. But I don't think he used that text in Iowa a couple days later. I don't think this is the text. So I think he must have decided, I'm not going to read the paper I just read a couple days
he would
ago
never do
in
that.
Minneapolis. I'm going to do something different on the topic here based on the 7 or talks I've already given and the 3 more that are coming. Whatever number this is, I forgot. This is number 4. Based on what I've done so far and what's coming. All right, so he must have put the text aside. Jay Goulden, thanks. You've been very patient, Jay. This will be the end of our session today.
Just a very short comment. Really enjoyed talking to everybody today. There's something that Heidegger said based on Schelling is I could understand something without having words. I can't have words without understanding. But it took me to something that James Risser was saying about unbedingt, that often gets translated as unconditioned, is the unbethinged is through Schelling. If you look at that very carefully, it starts moving away from meaning as Bedeutung to Andeutung. It's a showing forth or pointing forth. Well, that's all I was going to say. I was going to say maybe you could get Don Marshall in the future to come and maybe talk a little bit about those lectures, then answer some of our questions.
Unfortunately, we lost Don last year.
Oh.
But he was a regular member of the group, and in some ways doing this was sort of in honor of him.
I see. Well, we'll have to read between the lines then, but always had good conversations with Don.
Yep, exactly. He was a great part of our group when he made it as long as he can, even near the end.
Mm-hmm.
But we're all here. I want to thank everybody for coming and joining us. We're going to meet again at the end of September 29th. And I'm working on what that's going to be. It looks like it's going to be a brand new translation of an audio recording of a joint talk between Gadamer and Heidegger that is being translated. So that could be pretty interesting if we can get that all ready and prepared in time to read and discuss it. So that'll be at the in September. I think it's September 29th. So hopefully that comes together. You'll hear more from me before then. Yes, Shaba.
Let me make a suggestion
Sure.
for a topic that could be connected to what we were talking about today, and that's the challenge of post hermeneutics made by the German philosopher Mersch, who wrote a book with this title, and also Hans Gumprecht wrote a book both in English and in German, Jenseits der Hermeneutik, which so these authors challenge the idea that beyond or independent of materiality of science texts and so on, that there could be a meaning that is the focal point or object of interpretation. I mean, that's just that would be a kind of continuation of what we were talking today, but.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks for the suggestion. I'll look into both those things. All right. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate the conversation.
Sure.
Nice to see
Thank
everybody.
you for the organization.
Everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
See you. David, I'll send you that lecture by Gadamer.
Great. I'd love to see it.
Anyway, lovely to see you.
Thanks for joining us again. It was great.
Oh, it's great.